Morning of the hearing, I burned my toast. I stood in my kitchen in my dress uniform, watching the smoke curl up toward the ceiling, and I thought, this is fine. This is actually fine. I turned off the toaster, threw the bread in the trash, and drank my coffee black. I hadn't eaten a real meal in 4 days anyway. My brother was already at the courthouse. I knew that because my mother had called me at 6 a.m. to tell me like it was something I needed to know, like it was a warning. Donovan got there early, she said. He wants to talk before things start. I told her I'd see her inside. She hung up without saying goodbye. I'd spent 11 years in the Army, 2 deployments, a citation. I don't talk about at dinner parties. And the thing that was about to undo me was a property dispute in suburban Ohio in the county courthouse where I'd once won a spelling bee in 4th grade. Life has a sense of humor like that. Let me back up. Donovan is 4 years older than me. He was always the one who knew how to work a room, how to shake the right hand, laugh at the right moment, make people feel like he was doing them a favor just by paying attention to them. My father called it charisma. My mother called it a gift. I grew up calling it what it actually was, which was performance. But no one in my family wanted to hear that, so I learned to keep it to myself. I was always the quiet one. The one who read too much, stayed out too late on the back porch looking at nothing in particular. When I told my parents I'd enlisted the summer after high school, my mother cried, not out of pride. She sat at the kitchen table and pressed a dish towel against her face and said, "Why would you do that to yourself?" My father just nodded slowly, the way he did when he'd already made peace with something before it happened. Donovan took me out to Applebee's that night, just the 2 of us, and bought me a Coke and told me I was brave. I believed him. He was good at making you believe him. He went into finance, started at a brokerage firm in Columbus, got his Series 7, moved up fast. By the time I finished my first deployment, he was wearing suits that cost more than my monthly paycheck and driving a car I didn't recognize. He'd moved out of Ohio by then, landed in Charlotte, then Atlanta, eventually settled in a suburb of Nashville that had the kind of manicured lawns and HOA newsletters that make me feel like I'm not breathing real air. My grandmother died when I was 26. She left us each something. Donovan got the investment accounts, the ones with actual liquidity. He'd been managing them for her the last few years of her life, so that made sense to everyone. I got the house. Her house. The one on Clover Hill Road where she'd lived since 1971, where the kitchen still smelled like her lotion and there was a crack in the bathroom tile she'd always meant to fix. It wasn't worth a fortune, but it was mine. She'd said so in writing. I was in Germany when the will was finalized. I signed the paperwork, filed it with the county, and my grandmother's attorney sent me a copy from my records. I put it in a folder in the fireproof box I keep under my bed, next to my discharge documents and my deployment orders and the birthday cards my grandmother sent me every year without fail, even to APO addresses, even when it took 3 weeks for them to arrive. I trusted that things were handled. That was my first mistake. Not the trusting exactly. The not watching. 4 years later, I came home for good. Honorable discharge, medical separation, the kind that comes with paperwork and appointments and a VA case number. My right knee was the thing, mostly. And some other things I don't need to go into here. The point is, I came home and I was ready to start figuring out what came next. And one of the things I was counting on was that house on Clover Road. It was gone, not burned down, not condemned. Sold. Sold to a couple from Indiana for $214,000, 14 months before I got back stateside. The deed transfer was recorded with the county. The signature on the seller's authorization looked enough like mine that I had to look at it twice. It wasn't mine. I sat in my rental car in the parking lot of the county recorder's office for 40 minutes before I could make myself move. There was a woman pushing a stroller past the window, a guy eating a sandwich on a bench. Normal afternoon. Normal world. I just sat there with a photocopy of a document that had my name on it and was not mine and tried to figure out how to hold that. I called Donovan that night. He answered on the 3rd ring, which means he saw my name and let it ring twice before picking up. I know his habits. "Hey, stranger," he said, like we were friends who'd fallen out of touch, like this was catching up. I told him what I'd found. There was a pause. Not a surprised pause. A calculated one. The kind that's just long enough to sound like surprise without actually being it. Wow, that's a lot. There must be some kind of error in the records. Those county offices make mistakes all the time. Donovan. I'm serious. Records get misfiled. Names get the notary stamp, I said. The address on the notarization. It's a UPS store 3 blocks from your office in Nashville. Another pause. Longer this time? We should talk in person, he said. Yes, I said. We should. He never came. He sent a text 2 days later that said he'd spoken to a real estate attorney and there may have been a misunderstanding about power of attorney during your deployment and that he wanted to make things right. He didn't answer when I called back. He didn't respond when I asked in writing for him to explain exactly what power of attorney he was referring to, because I had never signed one. I found a lawyer. Her name was Patricia, and she had an office above a dry cleaner in Dayton and a reputation for not losing. I liked her immediately. She looked at the documents I brought her, spread them across her desk, and was quiet for a long time. Then she looked up at me and said, "Someone committed forgery on a federal level. Your brother had access. You were overseas. This is not complicated." She paused. "It is, however, going to be ugly." I told her I'd been in uglier places. What I didn't tell her, what I didn't tell anyone, was how bad the nights had gotten by then. Not sleeping mostly, lying in the dark in my rental apartment with the fan running and my brain just going, running through the timeline again and again, wondering when it had started, wondering if there had been signs I'd missed. I kept thinking about this one phone call, maybe 3 years back, when my grandmother was still alive and Donovan had called me. Unusual. He almost never called, just to catch up, he said. And he'd asked very casually whether I still had copies of the deed, whether I kept physical documents or just digital, whether my unit had a secure mail forwarding system. I'd thought he was just making conversation. I'd thought he was being a good brother. I'd been wrong before. I know how to sit with that. The mediation didn't work. Donovan showed up with a lawyer who wore a very expensive watch and spoke in complete paragraphs, and they argued that I had tacitly consented to the property management arrangement by not objecting in writing, and that any irregularities were administrative in nature. Patricia put a copy of the forged authorization on the table and asked them to explain the notary stamp. They said they'd need time to investigate. We went to court. My mother called me the night before the hearing. She'd been calling regularly by that point. Not to support me exactly, but to ask me to reconsider. "This is tearing the family apart," she said. "Donovan is your brother." I asked her if she knew what he'd done. She said she was sure it was more complicated than it looked. I told her I loved her and said goodnight and sat on the bathroom floor for a while after that, not crying, just breathing, just counting tiles. Donovan had used the 14 months between the sale and my return well. He built a paper trail that suggested I'd been kept informed. Emails that looked like they'd come from an account of mine. Except the domain was off by 1 letter, the kind of thing you don't notice unless you're looking. Printed screenshots of text conversations I'd never had. A timeline that made it look like I'd agreed, step by step, to everything. His lawyer called me confused twice in the opening statement. Said my service history, the deployments, the medical separation, might have affected my ability to track complex matters. I watched the judge's face when he said that. The judge was a woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses on a chain and the expression of someone who had heard a great many things and was not easily impressed. I did not react. I had learned over many years and in many contexts how to make my face do nothing. My lawyer laid out the forgery case methodically. The notary who'd stamped the authorization had been deposed. She worked at that UPS store. She remembered the transaction, and the person who'd brought the document in was not a woman in her late 20s who'd been stationed overseas. She'd described him in detail. Medium height, dark hair, the kind of confident manner that makes people not ask follow-up questions. Patricia also put an expert on the stand who had analyzed the signature. Not consistent with mine. Different pen pressure, different letter formation, different baseline angle. The kind of thing that takes a professional about 20 minutes to establish and is, once established, extremely difficult to argue with. Donovan's lawyer pivoted, started suggesting that I had a history of instability, that my medical separation was more complicated than a knee injury, that I had struggled to reintegrate. He didn't use the word unstable outright, he was too careful for that, but he arranged the words around it like furniture, around a hole in the floor. I kept my hands flat on the table in front of me. And then Patricia asked the judge for a brief recess. When we came back, she made a request I hadn't known she was going to make. She had submitted a request to several individuals who had indicated they wished to appear as character witnesses, and she asked the court's permission to allow them to enter. The judge looked at the request. Then she said, with the particular cadence of someone who already knows something is about to happen, "Lock the doors, please." The bailiff moved. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened first. 9 people walked in. They wore civilian clothes, but they walked the way soldiers walk. A thing you either recognize or you don't. They were men and women, different ages, different faces, and every one of them had served with me. Some at Fort Campbell. 1 from my second deployment. 2 from the rehabilitation program I'd helped run after my separation. Veterans relearning how to be in the world, and I had been one of the people sitting across the table from them on their worst days. They'd come because Patricia had asked, and because they'd said yes without hesitation, and because that is the thing about the people you serve with that no one who hasn't done it will ever fully understand. They come. One of them, Sergeant First Class Rennick, retired, who had known me since I was 22 years old and still learning how to lead, walked to the front of the room, looked at the judge, and said clearly, "Ma'am, I'd like to speak to the character and credibility of Captain Joanna Mercer." That was my rank. Captain. I'd not gone by it since I got out. I had not cried in that courtroom. I did not cry then either. But something shifted in my chest that I don't have a clean word for. It was like something that had been clenched for a very long time let go all at once. Rennick testified. 2 others testified. They talked about my service record, my leadership, the kind of person I was under pressure. They talked about the rehabilitation program. One of the women, Alvarez, who I'd worked with for 8 months and who barely spoke at first and eventually became someone who could walk into a room full of strangers and advocate for herself, said, "She showed up for us before she had finished showing up for herself." That's not someone who loses track of her property because she's confused. That's someone who trusts people she shouldn't have to doubt. The courtroom was quiet after that. Donovan's lawyer asked for a brief recess. It was not granted. The judge addressed the court. She had reviewed the evidence. She had heard the testimony. She noted that the signature analysis, the notary deposition, and the email domain discrepancy together constituted a coherent pattern that the defense had not satisfactorily explained. She referred the case immediately to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. She issued a temporary injunction on the sale proceeds. Donovan had not spent all of it, which was either luck or hubris, probably both, and appointed a receiver to hold the funds pending resolution. 2 of the people who had walked in with my former colleagues were federal marshals. They were there because Patricia, and I will never stop being grateful to her, had filed a parallel complaint with the U.S. Attorney's Office 3 weeks earlier regarding the forgery, which, because it involved the deed transfer and fabricated documents used in a federal proceeding, constituted wire fraud and fraud against a veteran. They arrested Donovan in the courtroom. He looked at me when they put the handcuffs on. Just for a second. I don't know what he was looking for. I didn't give it to him. I looked at the judge instead. I didn't stay for the arraignment. I walked out of the courthouse with Patricia on one side and Rennick on the other, into the October air that smelled like wet leaves and exhaust, and I stood on the steps for a long moment and just breathed. "You good?" Rennick asked. "Working on it," I said. He nodded. That was enough. Donovan was charged on 4 counts: wire fraud, forgery of a legal instrument, fraud against a protected veteran, and identity theft. He pled not guilty. His trial date was set for the following spring. His bail was set at $150,000, which he could make, barely, which meant he went home to that house in Nashville with the manicured lawn while I went back to my rental apartment. That part is still hard. I'm not going to pretend it isn't. My mother called. She did not apologize. She said she needed time to process. I told her I understood, because I do understand. It is hard to watch someone you love become someone you don't recognize, and it is hard to admit that you didn't see it coming. And it is hard to know that the choice you have to make now is between the version of the family you believed in and the truth. I know how hard that is. I made that same choice. She said she'd call again. I said okay. I'm still waiting, but I'm not waiting in the same way I used to wait, standing by the door hoping. I'm waiting in the background. If she comes, she comes. The house on Clover Hill Road is not recoverable. The couple from Indiana bought it in good faith. They are not at fault. The sale proceeds are frozen pending the criminal proceeding, and Patricia believes I will eventually recover a significant portion. Enough to rebuild, she says, though she's careful about what that word promises. I believe her. Or I'm learning to. What I do now, what I started doing 6 months ago, is work with a nonprofit in Dayton that provides legal and financial counseling to veterans who've been defrauded or financially exploited. It happens more than people know. People who were deployed, who trusted someone back home to handle things, who came back to find accounts drained, property transferred, businesses stolen. People who spent their best years serving and came back to find the people they trusted had used that time well in the wrong direction. I sit across the table from them. I know what their face looks like. That particular combination of disbelief and shame, like somehow they should have seen it, like trusting someone you love was the failure. I tell them it wasn't. I tell them we can figure out what comes next. And I mean it, because I am figuring out what comes next myself, one day at a time, one document at a time, one carefully labeled folder in a fireproof box under my bed. My grandmother always said that what you do when things fall apart says more about you than anything you do when they're going well. She said it like it was comfort. I used to think that was easy for her to say. I don't think that anymore. I poured myself coffee the morning after the verdict and sat at my kitchen table in the quiet and let myself feel it. All of it. The relief and the grief and the particular exhaustion of having been right about something you desperately wanted to be wrong about. I let it sit there with me. I didn't try to move it along. Then I got up, rinsed my cup, and went to work. I've thought a lot about what actually happened. Not the legal version, not the timeline Patricia built for the court, but the real version. The one that starts years before any document was forged. Donovan didn't become someone who could steal from his sister overnight. That's the part people don't want to sit with. It's easier to think of betrayal as a single moment, a switch that flips, but it isn't. It's a long series of small choices. To take a little more, to justify a little better, to tell himself one more time that I wouldn't notice, or that I owed him somehow, or that I'd be fine. Every time he got away with something small, it got easier to reach for something bigger. That's not a mystery. That's just how it works when a person stops holding themselves accountable to anything outside their own convenience. And I played a role in it too. Not in the fraud. That was his entirely. But in the conditions that made it possible. I trusted without verifying. I assumed that love meant safety, that family meant protection, that because we'd grown up in the same house we were operating from the same set of values. We weren't. We probably hadn't been for a long time, and I'd chosen not to look at that too closely because looking at it closely was painful. That's the thing about intelligence that took me a long time to understand. It isn't just about being sharp or strategic or good at problem solving. It's about being willing to see things clearly even when the clear version is the one you don't want. I had the capacity to ask harder questions about Donovan years before any of this happened. I didn't ask them. That wasn't failure of ability. That was failure of honesty. With myself first. What Rennick and the others did that day in the courtroom, showing up without being asked twice, standing in a room full of strangers and saying clearly who I was, that wasn't performance. That was the result of years of showing up for each other in conditions where showing up actually costs something. Character isn't what you claim about yourself. It's what accumulates between you and other people over time, in the moments when it would have been easier to look away. I'd spent 11 years building that with those people, one hard day at a time, and it held when I needed it to. Donovan spent those same years building something else, a version of himself that looked successful from the outside and was hollow in the middle. And eventually that hollowness needed to be filled with something, and he reached for the easiest thing available, which happened to be mine. The consequences he's facing now aren't punishment handed down from somewhere outside. They're the direct result of the choices he made, compounding over time until the weight became impossible to hide. That's how it actually works. Not dramatically, not instantly. Just steadily, the way anything real accumulates. What I'm trying to hold on to. What I want to carry forward into the work I do now, sitting across from veterans who are learning to rebuild, is this. Integrity isn't what you do when people are watching. It's the whole of what you do when they aren't. It's the document you file correctly even though no one will check. It's the truth you tell even when the comfortable version is available. It's the trust you refuse to betray even when betraying it would be easy and profitable and probably undetected. Donovan thought no one was watching. He was right for a while, but the record was always there. The notary stamp was always there. The domain name off by one letter was always there. Things leave traces. People leave traces. And eventually someone who knows what to look for will look. I'm still figuring out what comes next for me. The house is gone and that grief is real. But I wake up in the morning and I know exactly who I am, and I know that the people who showed up for me in that courtroom knew exactly who I was too. That's not nothing. Some days it's everything.